Nearly everyone whose ancestors lived outside Africa carries Neanderthal DNA. It survives in genes connected to immunity, skin, metabolism, and even the way our bodies respond to the modern world. But there is one place where that ancestry almost disappears: the X chromosome. For years, scientists believed natural selection had erased Neanderthal DNA from this part of the human genome. Then researchers examined the same chromosome inside Neanderthals and discovered the exact opposite pattern. Neanderthal X chromosomes contained far more Homo sapiens DNA than expected. The two genetic signatures formed a mirror image that should not have existed if men and women from both populations had mixed equally. And the explanation points toward an extraordinary possibility. The Neanderthal DNA inside living people may have come overwhelmingly from Neanderthal fathers, not Neanderthal mothers. So what happened to the women? Why did their genetic lines almost disappear, while Neanderthal male ancestry survived inside billions of people? The answer is forcing scientists to rethink not only how our ancestors encountered Neanderthals, but what extinction really means. To understand why this discovery is so strange, we first need to understand what scientists expected to find. Most of the DNA inside a human cell is organized into 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 of those pairs are known as autosomes. The final pair contains the sex chromosomes. Most females inherit 2 X chromosomes, one from each parent. Most males inherit an X chromosome from their mother and a Y chromosome from their father. That difference matters because the X chromosome does not travel through generations in the same way as the rest of the genome. A father passes his X chromosome to his daughters, but never to his sons. A mother can pass one of her X chromosomes to either a son or a daughter. This means that the direction of an ancient pairing leaves a mathematical signature. Imagine a Neanderthal father having children with a Homo sapiens mother. Their sons receive the mother's human X chromosome and the father's Neanderthal Y chromosome. Their daughters receive one human X from their mother and one Neanderthal X from their father. Now reverse the pairing. Imagine a Homo sapiens father and a Neanderthal mother. Every one of their children, sons and daughters, must receive a Neanderthal X chromosome from their mother. If both types of pairing happened equally often, Neanderthal ancestry should have entered the human X chromosome at a predictable rate. But it did not. When researchers examined the genomes of living people, they found Neanderthal ancestry across much of the genome, yet the X chromosome contained far less of it than expected. Large sections appeared almost empty. Geneticists began calling these regions Neanderthal deserts. It was as though Neanderthal ancestry had entered the ancestors of modern humans, spread across their chromosomes, and then mysteriously failed to survive in one of the most important parts of the genome. For years, scientists believed they understood why. Perhaps some Neanderthal genes were simply incompatible with the Homo sapiens genome. When two populations remain separated for hundreds of thousands of years, mutations accumulate independently inside each group. Most of those differences may cause no problem. But when the genomes are combined in hybrid children, certain combinations can interfere with development or reproduction. The X chromosome is especially important in this process because males normally possess only one X chromosome. Harmful variants carried there cannot always be hidden by a second copy. If a Neanderthal version of an X-linked gene caused even a small reproductive disadvantage, natural selection could remove it relatively quickly, generation after generation. Descendants carrying those combinations might produce slightly fewer surviving children. Nothing dramatic would need to happen. There would be no sudden wave of deaths and no single generation in which the DNA disappeared. A tiny disadvantage repeated for thousands of years could gradually empty entire regions of Neanderthal ancestry. This explanation appeared to fit the evidence. It also matched another observation. The surviving Neanderthal DNA in modern humans is not distributed randomly. Some inherited variants were removed, while others survived because they were harmless or potentially useful. The genetic legacy visible today is therefore not a complete record of the original encounters. It is what remained after tens of thousands of years of selection. That seemed to solve the mystery. Neanderthal DNA had once entered the X chromosome, but natural selection had erased much of it. Then scientists looked at the exchange from the opposite direction. Neanderthals did not only contribute DNA to Homo sapiens. Ancient genomes have shown that gene flow also moved from early modern humans into Neanderthal populations. The two groups met more than once, and their genetic exchanges occurred during different periods of prehistory. This gave researchers an extraordinary opportunity. If genetic incompatibility had removed Neanderthal ancestry from the human X chromosome, then the same biological problem should have produced a similar pattern in reverse. Modern human ancestry should also have been reduced on Neanderthal X chromosomes. The researchers expected to find another desert. Instead, they found the opposite. The Neanderthal X chromosomes contained an unusual excess of DNA inherited from early modern humans. On one side of the relationship, modern human X chromosomes were depleted of Neanderthal ancestry. On the other side, Neanderthal X chromosomes were enriched with modern human ancestry. The two genomes preserved mirror images of the same ancient process. And that is the pattern scientists had struggled to explain through incompatibility alone. The DNA was not disappearing equally in both directions. It appeared to be entering each population differently from the beginning. Researchers tested demographic models to determine what kind of ancient interaction could produce this pattern. Differences in migration might have contributed. Perhaps males traveled between communities more frequently than females. Perhaps children were absorbed into one population rather than the other. Natural selection could still have removed some inherited DNA afterward. But the simplest explanation for the overall pattern was a powerful bias in the direction of the pairings. The encounters that successfully contributed to later generations appear to have involved Neanderthal males and Homo sapiens females, far more often than Homo sapiens males and Neanderthal females. This did not mean the opposite pairing never occurred. A Homo sapiens man and a Neanderthal woman could have had children. Those children may even have survived and formed families of their own. But their genetic lines either remained rarer, were less reproductively successful, stayed largely within Neanderthal communities, or disappeared when those communities eventually vanished. Meanwhile, the descendants of Homo sapiens mothers and Neanderthal fathers entered populations that continued expanding across Eurasia. Their ancestry survived. Their children had children. Those descendants spread into new territories, carrying fragments of Neanderthal DNA with them. Thousands of generations later, that same ancestry remains inside billions of living people. The study did not discover a supernatural gene. It did not find a biological feature that violated the laws of inheritance. What scientists uncovered was something more subtle and perhaps more extraordinary. The chromosomes preserved evidence of social behavior that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. DNA had recorded which kinds of couples were most likely to leave descendants. The missing Neanderthal ancestry on the human X chromosome was not merely an empty space. It was the surviving outline of relationships that had unfolded between two different human populations. But this creates a dangerous temptation. We might imagine a simple prehistoric scene. Powerful Neanderthal men repeatedly taking Homo sapiens women while Neanderthal women remained excluded. The genes cannot prove that. DNA can reveal patterns of ancestry. It cannot tell us what two individuals felt, whether a relationship was accepted by their communities, whether it was voluntary, or whether it resulted from conflict. No genome contains memories. It does not preserve love, fear, status, violence, negotiation, or the social rules governing an Ice Age family. The same genetic pattern could emerge from several very different human realities. Perhaps Neanderthal men were more likely to leave their communities and join Homo sapiens groups. Perhaps Homo sapiens women were more mobile between populations. Perhaps children usually remained with their mother's community. If so, children born to Homo sapiens mothers would have entered the expanding Homo sapiens population, while children born to Neanderthal mothers would have remained within Neanderthal communities. That alone could create an enormous difference in which genetic lines survived. One group continued growing and spreading. The other eventually disappeared as a distinct population. Under this scenario, Neanderthal women may not have had fewer hybrid children at all. Their descendants simply may not have become the ancestors of living people. This is the distinction that makes the mystery so difficult. The DNA inside us does not provide a complete count of ancient births. It only records the family lines that survived long enough to reach the present. Millions of people may have lived, reproduced, and raised children while leaving no detectable genetic contribution to anyone alive today. A lineage can flourish for several generations and then vanish because its final descendants have no children. In small Ice Age populations, this could happen surprisingly easily. Neanderthal communities were often much smaller than modern populations. In some regions, they appear to have lived in isolated groups with limited numbers of unrelated partners. Under those conditions, every successful family carried enormous demographic importance. One woman's descendants could influence the future of an entire local population. But the reverse was also true. If her descendants remained inside a group that later disappeared, her entire genetic line could disappear with it. This offers one possible explanation for the strange absence at the heart of the story. Neanderthal women may not have been excluded from encounters with Homo sapiens. They may not have been biologically incapable of producing surviving children. Instead, their children may have remained on the wrong side of population history. The descendants of Neanderthal fathers entered the population that survived. The descendants of Neanderthal mothers may often have remained in the population that did not. Yet even this explanation cannot solve everything, because Neanderthals were not a single isolated community. They occupied an enormous territory, stretching from the Atlantic edge of Europe to Central Asia and Siberia. Different groups lived under different environmental pressures, maintained different social networks, and encountered Homo sapiens at different times. Some populations exchanged genes with newcomers. Others apparently did not. Some Neanderthal communities experienced severe isolation and close-kin reproduction. Others maintained regional connections and healthy levels of genetic diversity. The history recorded in their DNA is therefore not one continental event. It is a mosaic. And hidden inside that mosaic is a second discovery that makes the disappearance of Neanderthal women's genetic legacy even harder to explain. Because scientists have now examined some of the final Neanderthal communities in Western Europe, they expected to find small, genetically exhausted groups already approaching collapse. Instead, they found populations that were still connected, still genetically diverse, and apparently still capable of surviving. These Neanderthals were not simply fading away, and yet, only a short time later, they were gone. The evidence came from 27 Neanderthal individuals recovered across 10 archaeological sites in Belgium and France. Among them was an exceptionally well-preserved individual who lived roughly 45,000 years ago, during one of the most critical periods in European prehistory. This was close to the time when Homo sapiens had begun entering parts of the continent. If the traditional explanation were correct, these late Neanderthals should have carried the genetic scars of a population already collapsing. Their communities should have been tiny. Their genomes should have revealed severe inbreeding. Harmful mutations should have been accumulating as isolated families repeatedly reproduced with close relatives. Instead, the researchers found something very different. These Neanderthals belonged to communities that remained connected across a broad region. Neighboring groups appear to have exchanged partners, often enough to preserve healthy levels of genetic diversity. They were not one isolated family trapped inside a single cave. They were part of a larger social landscape. Individuals moved between communities. Relationships connected distant camps. Genetic diversity continued to flow across the region. This does not mean their population was enormous. Even healthy Neanderthal communities were probably small compared with the human populations that occupy Europe today. But small is not the same as genetically doomed. A network of connected groups can maintain diversity even when each local community contains relatively few people. When individuals move between those groups, they introduce new genetic variation. Close relatives are less likely to become the only available partners, and harmful mutations are less likely to spread unchecked. That appears to be what happened in parts of northwestern Europe. The final Neanderthals living. They were not simply the exhausted survivors of a population that had already passed the point of recovery. They were maintaining relationships across the landscape. They were exchanging partners. They were surviving in environments their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years, and yet they still disappeared. This discovery weakens one of the most familiar explanations for Neanderthal extinction. Inbreeding may have harmed some communities, especially those that became severely isolated. Ancient genomes from other regions clearly show close biological relationships and extremely small local populations. But the new evidence demonstrates that this condition was not universal. Different Neanderthal groups experienced different demographic realities. Some were isolated. Others remained connected. Some may have approached collapse long before Homo sapiens arrived. Others remained genetically viable almost until the end. There was no single Neanderthal population following one inevitable path toward extinction. There were many populations, each responding differently to climate, geography, migration, and contact with other humans. This regional complexity matters because it changes how we interpret the missing genetic legacy of Neanderthal women. If all Neanderthal communities had been severely inbred and collapsing, the answer might appear simple. Perhaps their family lines disappeared because nearly every part of their population was already failing. But healthy, connected communities complicate that story. Women in these groups were not necessarily trapped inside tiny families without unrelated partners. Their populations still possessed the social structure required to exchange mates and preserve diversity. They were capable of maintaining themselves. So why did their genetic contribution remain so limited in living humans? The Belgian and French genomes provided another important clue. These Neanderthals lived during a period when early Homo sapiens had already entered parts of Europe. Both populations may have occupied neighboring regions for hundreds of generations. There were caves, hunting territories, valleys, rivers, and migration routes that both groups could have used. Opportunities for contact should have existed, but researchers found no clear evidence that these northwestern Neanderthals carried recent Homo sapiens ancestry. Their genomes remained distinctly Neanderthal. This is surprising because the genetic exchange in the opposite direction is undeniable. Ancient and living Homo sapiens genomes contain Neanderthal ancestry. Some early modern humans carried even more Neanderthal DNA than people do today, showing that their Neanderthal ancestors had lived only a few generations earlier. Neanderthal DNA repeatedly entered expanding Homo sapiens populations, yet in this particular region. Homo sapiens DNA does not appear to have entered the Neanderthal population in the same way. Once again, the exchange looks asymmetric. This does not mean there was an absolute barrier between the groups. It does not mean every Neanderthal community refused contact with Homo sapiens. Earlier evidence shows that modern human ancestry had entered some Neanderthal populations long before these final European encounters. Gene flow occurred in both directions across the larger history of the two groups, but it was not constant. It was not geographically uniform, and it was not socially equal. Some encounters produced descendants who entered Homo sapiens populations. Other encounters may have produced children who remained within Neanderthal communities. Some regions experienced repeated genetic exchange. Others remained surprisingly separate. Even when the two populations lived close enough to encounter one another, human evolution was not a single wave moving evenly across a continent. It was a patchwork of local histories. In one valley, two populations may have competed for the same herds and caves. In another, they may have exchanged tools, knowledge, or partners. Some relationships may have connected communities for generations. Others may have ended after a single encounter. The genetic pattern visible today is the combined result of all those different histories. But only some of those histories left descendants. This is where the mystery of Neanderthal women becomes inseparable from the disappearance of Neanderthals themselves. Consider two hypothetical children. The first has a Homo sapiens mother and a Neanderthal father. If that child remains with the mother's community, it becomes part of a population that is expanding, traveling, and forming connections across Eurasia. The child grows up among Homo sapiens. It has children within that population. Its descendants move into new territories. The Neanderthal DNA inherited from the father becomes part of the growing Homo sapiens gene pool. Now consider the reverse. A child has a Neanderthal mother and a Homo sapiens father. If that child remains with the mother's community, its descendants become part of the Neanderthal population. They may survive for many generations. They may hunt, raise families, travel between camps, and contribute to healthy regional networks. But when the last Neanderthal populations disappear as distinct communities, that family line disappears with them. Both pairings may have produced healthy children. Both may have created families, but only one entered the population that survived into the present. Over thousands of years, this difference would become intermittent. The ancestry of Neanderthal fathers could spread through expanding Homo sapiens communities. The ancestry of Neanderthal mothers could remain concentrated inside populations that eventually vanished. From the perspective of people living at the time, both family lines were real. From the perspective of modern genetics, only one remains visible. This may help explain why the DNA appears to tell such a one-sided story. But it still does not explain why children would have followed their mother's communities, or why one direction of pairing may have occurred more often than the other. The answer may lie in social organization. Hunter-gatherer communities can follow very different rules regarding residence and movement. In some societies, women move to the community of their partner. In others, men move. Some groups maintain strong ties between neighboring families, while others treat outsiders with suspicion. Marriage can connect communities. It can also reflect alliances, competition, demographic pressure, or the need to find unrelated partners. We do not know which rules governed Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens communities. Archaeology can reveal where people lived, what they ate, which tools they made, and sometimes how far materials traveled. Genetics can identify biological relationships, but neither can fully reconstruct the private decisions behind an Ice Age family. We cannot know whether a particular individual left willingly. We cannot know whether two communities accepted their children equally. We cannot know whether relationships emerged through cooperation, social exchange, chance meetings, or violence. The genes preserve the outcome. They do not preserve the experience. Biology may have added another filter. Even when hybrid children were born and accepted into a community, not every genetic combination would have survived equally well. Some combinations may have slightly reduced male fertility. Others may have interfered with development or reproduction. These disadvantages did not need to be catastrophic. A person carrying a particular Neanderthal segment might have been completely healthy, but produced slightly fewer surviving children. Repeated over hundreds of generations, that small difference could remove the segment from the population. This process would have been especially powerful on the X chromosome, because the X chromosome follows a different inheritance pattern from the autosomes. Sex-biased pairings and natural selection can leave particularly strong signals there. The missing Neanderthal ancestry may therefore reflect two processes operating together. First, more of the successful genetic exchange may have involved Neanderthal fathers and Homo sapiens mothers. Second, natural selection may have removed some of the Neanderthal ancestry that initially entered the X chromosome. The social bias created the pattern. Biological selection sharpened it. That combined explanation is more realistic than any single dramatic event. There was probably no moment when Neanderthal women suddenly stopped contributing to future populations. There was no decision made by an entire species. Instead, countless small events accumulated across thousands of years. A woman remained with one community instead of another. A child survived but left no descendants. A family line continued for 10 generations and then ended. A genetic variant slightly reduced fertility. A population became separated by changing climate. A neighboring group moved into a new valley. A local community lost several adults during a difficult winter. Another community received newcomers and recovered. Each event was ordinary on its own. Together, they reshaped the genetic history of humanity. This also changes how we should think about Neanderthal extinction. The word extinction creates an image of a species reaching a final moment when the last individual dies. But Neanderthals may not have disappeared through one clean event. Some populations probably declined and vanished locally. Others may have been absorbed into larger Homo sapiens communities. Children with mixed ancestry may have stopped being socially recognized as Neanderthal after only a few generations. As Homo sapiens populations expanded, the distinction between the two groups could have gradually dissolved in some regions. From an archaeological perspective, Neanderthals disappeared. From a genetic perspective, part of them survived. But that survival was selective. It preserved some people's ancestry more effectively than others. It retained certain useful genetic variants while removing others. And it may have carried forward the legacy of Neanderthal fathers far more often than the legacy of Neanderthal mothers. That is what makes the discovery so unsettling. The missing DNA is not merely evidence of biology. It represents lost family histories. Neanderthal women lived across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Their bones preserve the physical reality of their lives. Some survived serious injuries. Some gave birth. Some reached old age. They cared for children, processed food, moved through dangerous landscapes, and contributed to communities that endured repeated climatic upheavals. There is no reason to imagine that they were passive figures in Neanderthal society. In small hunter-gatherer groups, every experienced adult would have possessed valuable knowledge. Women would have understood seasonal resources, animal behavior, local terrain, childcare, food preparation, materials, shelter, and social relationships. Their survival mattered to the survival of the entire group. Yet the genetic contribution of those women appears unexpectedly faint inside living people. Not necessarily because they had no children, not necessarily because they could not produce fertile descendants, and not necessarily because Neanderthal communities were already genetically doomed. Their lines may simply have remained attached to populations that eventually disappeared. The fathers whose children entered Homo sapiens communities became part of us. The mothers whose children remained Neanderthal may have vanished from our genetic record. This is not a final answer. The available genomes represent only a tiny fraction of all the Neanderthals who once lived. Most individuals left no recoverable DNA. Many regions remain poorly sampled. Future discoveries could reveal populations with entirely different patterns. A single new genome can transform the interpretation of an entire region. That has already happened repeatedly in the study of human origins. The first Neanderthal genomes proved that interbreeding occurred. Later genomes showed that gene flow moved in both directions. Family groups revealed close relationships inside individual caves. Other populations demonstrated that severe inbreeding was not universal. And now the chromosomes themselves suggest that the successful exchange between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was deeply influenced by sex. Each discovery makes the story more complicated, but it also makes it more human. Neanderthals were not a failed experiment waiting to be replaced. They were populations of people adapting to unstable environments, forming families, maintaining social networks, and encountering another kind of human that was both familiar and different. Those encounters were not abstract evolutionary events. They happened between individuals. Every fragment of Neanderthal DNA inside a living person began with a real family, tens of thousands of years ago. A mother carried a child. A community raised that child. The child survived long enough to reproduce. Its descendants continued through wars, migrations, famines, diseases, and changing civilizations until that same fragment of DNA reached the present. But the fragments that survived tell only part of the story. They reveal the winners of genetic history. They say almost nothing about the countless families whose lines ended. That may be the true meaning of the impossible discovery. Scientists did not find a gene that broke the laws of nature. They found a pattern that should have looked balanced but did not. Modern humans contain unmistakable Neanderthal ancestry. Yet the chromosomes suggest that this ancestry entered our population through a surprisingly narrow route. Neanderthal men appear to have contributed successfully to the expanding Homo sapiens population far more often than Neanderthal women. The reverse pairings may have occurred. Their children may have lived. Their families may have survived for generations. But those lines rarely reached us. Somewhere between the caves of Ice Age Europe and the genomes of living people, most of their genetic legacy disappeared. And that leaves us with a final possibility. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not why Neanderthals went extinct. Perhaps it is why only certain Neanderthals were allowed by history to become part of us. The men left fragments inside billions of living people. The women left bones, communities, and unanswered questions. Their DNA may be faint, but the absence itself has become evidence. Evidence of ancient families, evidence of unequal survival, and evidence that the final chapter of Neanderthal history was not a simple extinction. It was a merger shaped by biology, social behavior, population expansion, and chance. A merger in which one side of the family was preserved and the other was almost erased. If this discovery changed the way you see Neanderthals, subscribe for more evidence hidden inside the ancient human genome. And tell us in the comments, do you think Neanderthals truly went extinct, or did they simply become part of us?